A rocking chair still sways, but no one's there. Welcome to Verités Obscures. I am your host William. I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and share where you're joining from. It's always a joy seeing your replies. Let's begin. It was the kind of day you only encounter in storybooks. The sky was a pristine century-old blue, and the air was fragrant with the sweet scent of honeysuckle and cut grass. In the village of Little Dedham, nestled in the heart of the Sussex countryside, a garden party at the newly restored Gossington Hall had drawn almost every respectable villager nearby, on foot or by bicycle. The estate had recently been acquired by a wealthy London couple, described by the former residents as very modern. The house, once a menacing shadow behind ivy and decay, now gleamed with fresh paint and immaculate lawns. Its revival had been the subject of much discussion in the village for weeks. Miss Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead, was visiting her niece in nearby Much Benham and had been cordially invited. She was sitting a reasonable distance from the main lawn, under a striped parasol, sipping tea and watching, as always, with a kind but penetrating gaze. "It's all been done so well," murmured Mrs. Lavinia Pratt, a local widow with strong, unfiltered opinions. "But I must say, having a nursery without children seems odd, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded amiably. "Yes, rather. But perhaps they hope to fill it." The garden buzzed with conversation. Guests circulated with strawberry tarts and glasses of elderflower cordial, while the local vicar lost a polite debate about begonias to Major Pendleton, who had never gardened in his life. At precisely 4:30, the harmony was pierced by a high, guttural cry. It came from inside the house. High, suddenly, unmistakably real. The whispers stopped. The clinking of china froze mid-air. Moments later, Mrs. Lydia Halbert staggered onto the terrace, her pale peach dress torn at the shoulder, her face a picture of shock. Arriving at the nursery, she gasped. "Oh my God, the nursery!" Before anyone could move, Mr. Halbert rushed past the guests and up the stone steps. A young maid, barely out of school, was seen running in the opposite direction, sobbing and clutching her apron. The party had turned. It was no longer a quaint gathering of village society, but the scene of something far darker. Minutes later, the grim news spread like fog. In the nursery, behind a white-painted door that had remained closed for as long as anyone could remember, was a body. A young woman. Unknown to most. And most likely dead. While the guests murmured and speculated in tight, scandalized circles, Miss Marple put down her teacup with the greatest care. Her gaze, piercing beneath the soft brim of her straw hat, remained fixed on the nursery window. "I suppose," she said quietly to herself, "that children aren't the only things that can disappear from a nursery. Sometimes it's innocent." Thus, the silent unease that had long lingered at Gosling Hall was finally taking shape. In Little Dedham, the past was about to awaken. By the next morning, the news had spread as fast and thick as ivy on an old church wall. In Little Dedham, secrets seldom stay buried, and this one, fresh, appalling, and deliciously scandalous, had electrified every drawing-room, kitchen, and tea-room within a 5-mile radius. At the village post office, where Mrs. Finch always took twice as long to sort the morning mail whenever something exciting was afoot, a small queue had formed. No one was in a hurry to leave. The Gossington Hall incident has become the new lifeblood of the village. Found in the nursery, you say? Mr. Cattermole, the retired lawyer, adjusted his glasses with unnecessary dramatic effect. Strange place for a corpse, wouldn't you agree? This room hasn't been used for years. It's not even properly furnished, interjected Mrs. Adela Tibbins, who had once worked as a part-time cleaner for the previous owners. Just bare walls and that abandoned rocking horse. Very strange, that. Apparently, she was wearing London clothes, whispered Clara Hodge, who claimed to have glimpsed the body through a crack in the door before she was led away. All silk and fashion. Not local, I think. Well, of course not. Scoffed Reverend Entwistle, arriving late and red-faced at the party, having misread the time on his wife's invitation. A strange woman found dead in the locked bedroom of a childless couple? Don't go pretending to be Sherlock Holmes and smell trouble there. Nearby, comfortably seated on the garden bench outside her niece's house in Much Benham, Miss Marple was listening, not with rapt attention, but with the gentle, thoughtful expression of someone watching birdsong or distant thunder. She held her knitting loosely in her lap, though the needles remained still. Her niece, Gwenda, came rushing out of the kitchen with a tray of scones and said briskly, "The whole village is drooling. You'd think they'd never seen a dead body." "To be honest, most of them haven't," whispered Miss Marple. "At least, not one that wasn't expected." "You were at the party, Aunt Jane. Did you know the girl?" "No," said Miss Marple softly, "but I noticed that Lydia Halberd seemed disturbed even before anything happened. She was fiddling with her gloves. She was looking at the house more than at the guests." "Well, in my opinion," said Gwenda, putting down the tray, "that's what buying old houses with tragic histories is all about. Places remember things. That childhood bedroom always gave you goosebumps." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And childhood bedrooms are often very revealing. They reflect the hopes, or sometimes the sorrows, of the household." Later that afternoon, a police constable was seen trudging up the lane leading to Gossington Hall, closely followed by the press. The London papers had already gotten wind of the story, partly thanks to one of the guests posting vague but tantalizing details on Chatternita, a new kind of village-wide chat room, now accessible by telephone rather than through garden fences. The Halberds had issued a brief and appallingly bland statement. The deceased, they said, was an unannounced guest who had arrived the day before. They had intended to speak to her privately about a family matter. They were deeply shocked by what had happened and were cooperating fully with the police. All this was perfectly normal, but it satisfied no one. By tea-time, the whole affair had been retold and reimagined in at least 9 different versions. Some said that the woman was Lydia Halberd's illegitimate sister, others that she was Mr. Halberd's mistress to stir up trouble. Still others suggested that she was no stranger to the house and that the nursery was not as empty as people thought. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Entwistle, visited Miss Marple under the pretext of borrowing a book, though it soon became clear that she had no real interest in literature. "What a terrible shock," she said, settling into the armchair and accepting a slice of Madeira cake. "Poor Lydia. I told Henry just this morning that she looked positively haunted at the garden party, didn't I? That pale smile, as if she had seen a ghost." Miss Marple nodded. "It's remarkable how often one smiles at the very moment one is most troubled. It's a habit one notices in those who are trying to keep up appearances. Do you think she knew this young girl?" "I think," said Miss Marple cautiously, "that Lydia Halberd is not the kind of girl to invite drama into her home lightly." And yet, drama happened. For the next 2 days, little Dedham settled into a rhythm of whispered theories and cautious glances. The local inspector, a frank, broad-chested man named Inspector Harwood, inquired with the vivacity of someone who would have preferred a discreet robbery to a mysterious death. He conversed with Miss Marple briefly, but without pressing the point. "You were at the party, were you not, Miss Marple? You saw nothing suspicious?" "Nothing suspicious," she replied mildly. "I noticed, however, that the maid who had shouted at young Sarah, I believe, had been unusually pale all afternoon. And she dropped a tray just before the scream was heard." Harwood took note, but did not seem unconvinced. "Nervousness, no doubt. Those Londoners and their parties." "Quite," said Miss Marple in a voice full of sympathy. "One wonders, though, what she could have seen to make her shout so convincingly. It wasn't hysteria, it was recognition." Harwood grunted and steered the conversation to less speculative topics. But Miss Marple remained thoughtful long after he had left. Later that evening, she walked slowly to Gossington Hall, ostensibly to deliver a note of condolence. The lawn was empty, the chairs piled up, the banners taken down. The house seemed larger, without the laughter to soften it. Lydia Halberd received her with forced politeness. She looked older than she had a few days before, the pronounced lines of her mouth deeper, her voice carefully measured. "Thank you for your kindness, Miss Marple. We're managing as best we can." "It must be dreadful," said Miss Marple with a sincere sweetness. "To meet someone you knew under such circumstances." Lydia hesitated, and for a moment the mask licked itself. "I didn't know her," she said too quickly. "I mean, not well. She arrived late. Unexpectedly." "Her?" Lydia blinked. "Sorry? You said she arrived late. Not the guest. Not the woman. But her. That implies a certain familiarity." For a moment the room was silent. A clock ticked in the corridor, and outside, a robin sang. Lydia pursed her lips and shook her head. "I'm afraid I can't say more, Miss Marple. The inspector advised us to refrain from speculation." Miss Marple rose slowly and picked up her gloves. "Perfectly. But sometimes it's precisely the things left unsaid that say the most." Stepping out into the cool of the evening, Miss Marple looked up again at the window of the nursery. It was closed, the curtains drawn. But somewhere behind that veil of lace and shadow, a truth still waited. Miss Marple, with the patience of someone who had spent her life observing the silent tragedies of the world, fully intended to discover it. The inquest was scheduled for Thursday, which gave Inspector Harwood 3 precious days to prepare for the start of an investigation. In the meantime, he occupied himself with interrogations, observations, and what he called trolling the river of rumors. He had stationed a uniformed officer at Gossington Hall and sent young Constable Drew to take statements from neighbors and staff. Officially, the young woman's name had not yet been made public, awaiting formal identification. Unofficially, half the village already claimed to know who she was or who she might have been. Miss Marple, however, had made no such assumptions. She rose early on Tuesday. Buttoning up her comfortable shoes, she set off with her cane and straw hat towards the village green. Day had broken, but a slight chill hung over it, as if nature itself were holding its breath. She met Mrs. Finch outside the post office. The postmistress is producing envelopes with her usual eagerness, but her eyes lit up as she saw Miss Marple approaching. "You will have heard her, of course," she begins without preamble. "They have been sent to London for a specialist. A pathologist, it seems. Imagine if little Dedham had a real forensic expert." "How thorough," said Miss Marple calmly. "And yet I often think that what people don't say is far more revealing than what they do." Have you noticed that no one seems able to describe the young woman? Mrs. Finch leaned forward eagerly. Only that she had dark hair and one of those coats like those worn by film stars. Someone said mink trim. Too smart for someone passing like that, don't you think? It makes you wonder, replied Miss Marple. And yet, if she had arrived the day before, she must have taken the train or a taxi. And someone would have seen her. She was dropped off in a car. That's what I heard, said Mrs. Finch, almost in a whisper. A black car. No one around here drives one like that. She was seen turning into Halbert's Drive after dusk. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So she hadn't just appeared. She had been brought in. At that moment, young Sarah, the maid who had shouted, passed across the road with a basket in her hand. She was walking briskly, but her eyes fell nervously on Miss Marple, then turned away. Miss Marple gave her a slight nod, and Sarah hesitated. After a moment, she crossed the road. Miss Marple, she said, almost breathless. I didn't mean to interrupt, but do you think I could ask you something? Of course, my dear. Let's walk a little. It's a lovely morning for it. Sarah followed her. Her hands were shaking slightly and her cheeks were pale under a thin layer of freckles. I wanted to ask if you think I'm in trouble. Trouble, my dear? Why? Sarah glanced around as if to make sure they couldn't be overheard. Because I found her. The woman. And I screamed. And I told the inspector what I saw, but he kept asking me the same questions as if I'd lied. And you? Miss Marple asked gently. No, ma'am, Sarah said firmly. But there's something I haven't told him. I didn't think it mattered. Sometimes it's the smallest things that mean the most. Sarah bit her lip, then nodded. It's the smell, you see. There was this smell when I opened the nursery door. Not blood, not at all at first. It was perfume. Sweet, strong. Like lilac or violet. Not like what Mrs. Halberd wears. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And it scared you? I suppose it did. Because it wasn't just the smell. It was how familiar it seemed. Like something I'd smelled in the house before. Miss Marple let the silence stretch a little before speaking. Familiar, how? Sarah hesitated. That room in the nursery was supposed to be locked. I cleaned it once, months ago, but no one's been in since. Then last week, I noticed the latch wasn't closing properly anymore. I mentioned it, but Mrs. Halberd just told her to leave her alone. So I did. They came to the corner of the drive and Sarah stopped. Please don't tell anyone I told you. I don't want to lose my job. Miss Marple patted her hand. You did well, my dear. And I expect you've remembered something very important. After Sarah had left, Miss Marple continued on her way to the vicarage. She used to stop there for tea on Tuesdays, and the vicar's wife, though prone to drama, was an incomparable source of village life. Oh, Jane, said Mrs. Entwistle, pouring, you must tell me what you think. I don't suppose the police have the slightest idea what's going on. Well, said Miss Marple, accepting her tea, they're trying, God bless them. But Inspector Harwood isn't a man to linger on subtleties. I told Henry. He just inhabits questions. No sense of nuance. For example, I'm pretty sure the Halberds know more than they let on, but he doesn't press the point. And no one has spoken to that woman's family, have they? That's the rub, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. No family has come forward. No one has claimed her. Was what raises the question really unknown? Or too well known? At Gossington Hall, the mood had shifted from shock to much greater tension. Mr. Halberd was rarely seen, citing headaches and official duties. Lydia Halberd, on the other hand, had resumed her walks in the garden, though shorter and more listless. Miss Marple saw her again that afternoon. "You must be very tired," she said softly. "All this attention, all these questions." Lydia smiled weakly. "It's exhausting, yes. But necessary, I suppose." "I wonder," said Miss Marple, her eyes fixed on her, "if you remember an actress named Charlotte Vale?" Lydia blinked. "Old films?" "Yes, vaguely." "She played a tragic woman, didn't she?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And one day she said something rather poignant. Sometimes a woman has to invent a story to outlive the one she's been given." Lydia looked down, her fingers clenched around her teacup. "I don't know what you mean." "Only that the truth always comes out in the end, even if it has to take a detour." Miss Marple took her leave soon after, but not without taking one last look around the house. This time the nursery window was ajar. That evening, Inspector Harwood summoned her. "We've identified the girl," he said. "Her name was Celia Moffat. Actress. Small parts. Not of family, strictly speaking, but a few friends in London. Missing last week," repeated the actress Miss Marple. "Yes. That makes sense." Harwood frowned. "You're not surprised?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "But I am curious to know what sort of part she was supposed to play and for whom." By Wednesday morning, the excitement had died down somewhat in Little Dedham, but the undercurrent of speculation continued to stir through the alleys like the wind through barley. Celia Moffat's name had begun to circulate, whispers and sidelong glances, and while few admitted to having heard her before, many now claimed to remember seeing her face somewhere on a playbill, in a magazine, or on television. Memory, in such matters, was as malleable as hot wax. In the Green Man pub, opinions were formed over demi-points and packets of crisps. "An actress, eh?" asked Jack Dallow, a mechanic whose entire London experience was limited to one foggy weekend in 1982. "Guaranteed trouble. They live adrift, these people." "Yet," murmured Mrs. Hemming, a widow with keen hearing and a penchant for conspiracy, "if she was invited by the Halberds, what was she doing dead in the nursery?" "Perhaps she had come to blackmail them," said one of the young men near the bar. "Something from their past." It was a well-crafted theory, appealing in its drama and simplicity. Inspector Harwood hadn't ruled it out either, even though he continued to insist, a little too publicly, that the crime was probably a private matter, with no connection to the village. Miss Marple, as ever, spoke little, though her mind was far from idle. She had just returned from a discreet conversation with the stationmaster, who confirmed that no woman matching Celia's description Moffat had arrived by train the day before the party. This, coupled with Mrs. Finch's observation of a black automobile, painted a very different picture, one of design rather than accident. Later that day, Inspector Harwood called a meeting at the manor house. Present were himself, Lydia and Charles Halford, young Sarah, the maid, and, at her personal, if somewhat reluctant, request, Miss Marple. The drawing-room had been refitted as a sort of interrogation room. The gay flowers that had once adorned the mantelpiece had been removed, and the windows remained open despite the cold, as if to clear the air of something no one dared name. Charles Halbert stood stiffly by the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back. His voice, when he spoke, was even and calm. She was uninvited, if that is what you are asking. I had not seen Celia Moffat for years. She must have heard of the garden party in some way, perhaps by a friend or by the village's advice. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. That would require an unusual coincidence, don't you think? Charles turned to her. Miss Marple, with all due respect, I don't see what your role is here. Harwood intervened. Miss Marple is helping with some behavioral observations. She's helped the court before, you know. Of course, Lydia said quickly, easing the tension with an expert smile. And her advice is always welcome. Charles didn't mean to sound ungrateful. I just meant it's a personal matter, he mumbled, then sat down heavily in an armchair. Tell me, Harwood said, taking out his notebook, when did you last see Miss Moffat before she arrived? Charles hesitated. 10 years ago. I was involved in a theatrical investment, nothing dramatic. We lost touch. And yet she turned up at your house unannounced, said Miss Marple gently. She sent word, Lydia interjected. It arrived the previous morning. She said she was passing through and hoped to see Charles for a quick word. We agreed she could come over that evening. I didn't know she'd be staying. Did you give her the nursery? Harwood asked. Yes, Lydia said slowly. It was the only room that was clean and fairly private. She arrived around 8 o'clock. We had a drink. I went to bed early with a headache. I didn't see her again. And you, Mr. Halbert? I talked to her until about 9:30. She seemed upset. Tired. She said she'd explain everything to me in the morning. Miss Marple's knitting lay quietly on her knees, the needles still. Did she explain anything, even partially? Charles looked away. Only that she needed help. Financially, I suppose. She wasn't specific. A silence fell over the room. Didn't you hear anything during the night? Harwood asked. Nothing, Lydia replied. Until Sarah screamed. The detective turned to the girl, who was standing by the door, pale and frozen. Sarah, are you the first to come into the nursery? Yes, sir, she said, her voice barely audible. I knocked. There was no answer. So I opened the door and saw her on the floor by the rocking horse. I screamed and ran. Didn't you touch anything? No, sir. I just ran. Miss Marple had her eyes fixed on Lydia Halbert. Forgive me, but why was the nursery still furnished, even partially? You don't have children, I understand. No, Lydia replied. It was the only room we hadn't entirely redone. The old furniture had remained there. I suppose I liked the idea of keeping a room intact. Silly, really. Not silly at all, said Miss Marple softly. But often meaningful. Nativity scenes are full of hope. And sometimes, regret. Charles Halbert straightened up, brushing his trousers. I don't know how she died, but I swear I had nothing to do with it. No one is accusing you, sir, said Harwood, though his voice was a little sour. In truth, Charles Halbert had become the natural suspect. He had the closest connection with Celia. He had admitted that she had come to see him. And, as Miss Marple suspected, he wasn't very forthcoming about their shared past. As she left, Miss Marple lingered at the foot of the stairs, looking up at the second floor. The nativity scene was behind the back door, barely visible from the landing. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move behind the curtains. But when she looked again, there was nothing. Outside, the sky had turned gray and the wind had picked up. Autumn was beginning to show its face. Inspector Harwood was walking beside her. "Well," he said, "it sounds simple. She comes back into his life, makes a request, and he panics. Classic case." "Maybe," said Miss Marple distantly. "But there's something wrong with this picture." "Something is wrong." "For example?" Celia Moffat wasn't dressed for despair. Her clothes were new, her coat expensive. Her hair was recently styled. That doesn't suggest someone begging for help. It suggests someone waiting for something, perhaps even promised something. "Do you think she was lured here?" "I think," Miss Marple answered quietly, "that she thought she was going home." Inspector Harwood frowned, but said nothing. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles finally busy again. Her thoughts were not of Charles or Lydia, but of the rocking horse in the nursery. Left in an unused room, it had waited there for years, motionless and dusty. Just like the secrets it had seen unfold. The next morning, the sky was overcast, a low mist curling around the hedges like the breath of a watchful spirit. In Little Dedham, the dim light lit the village, blurring its outlines and muffling the sounds. It was a day for secrets. Miss Marple was eating breakfast on the small veranda behind her niece's cottage, wrapped in a shawl and sipping her tea with her usual calm. Her knitting lay untouched beside her. Her thoughts weren't on cardigans or stitches today, but rather on the strange room at Gossington Hall, a nursery where no laughter could be heard, inhabited now only by silence and something even darker. Her attention returned, as it often did, to the rocking horse. It had been mentioned in almost every description of the nursery. Sarah had spoken of it in a frightened tone. Charles Halbert had alluded to it absently. Lydia had left it in place, despite the otherwise empty state of the room. A rocking horse, a relic left behind among the ghosts. Miss Marple decided to pay it a visit. Although she had come to the hall before under the guise of condolences, today's reason was more pragmatic. She had remembered, or rather pretended to remember, lending Lydia a book a few weeks earlier at a village committee lunch. Lydia, polite and distracted, confirmed this without hesitation and invited her in. The house was quieter than before, its grandeur tinged with tension. The drawing room, once filled with cheerful flower arrangements, now seemed empty. The staff walked more cautiously, their voices low and halting. Lydia led Miss Marple into the parlor and began to browse the bookcase. "It must be in there somewhere," she said absently. "You know, I can't even remember the title." "I think it was The Poison Garden," Miss Marple said softly. "A most disturbing little tale. But very instructive." "Ah. There it is." Lydia turned around, holding the slim volume between two fingers. Her smile was tight, her eyes tired. "I hope you don't find all this too sordid, Miss Marple." "Not sordid," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Tragic, certainly. But not sordid. There is a difference." By getting ready to take the book, Miss Marple cast a brief glance at the stairs behind the door. She noticed again that the level of the floor was partially visible from the corridor. A little curiosity, but important. "I guess no," she said with a slight hesitation. "Wouldn't you mind doing one last visit to the child's room? Just to appease a feeling that I only had to satisfy my curiosity." Lydia appeared an alarmed moment, then her expression softened. I guess there is no harm in that. The police have already finished the room, and she was cleaned. But the atmosphere is not quite there. Emotions rarely disappear, whispered Miss Marple. Especially in the rooms where life was once expected, but where it has never really arrived. Lydia led her upstairs. The door of the child's room was closed, but unlocked. When Lydia pushes her, the air was slightly flavored with lavender, perhaps, or something like that. But under this floral sweetness was hiding something else. Something colder. I leave you, said Lydia quickly. I will be just below. Miss Marple entered the room and closed the door behind her. The child's room was small but bright, with a large guillotine window overlooking the garden. The walls were pale blue, the wallpaper washed off but intact. A shelf, backed by a wall, contained some old toys/blocks, a rattle and a dusty plush bear. And there, in a corner, under the window, was the rocking horse. He was bigger than she imagined, his chopped but always brilliant painting. A dark mahogany mane floated with his head, and his eyes were made of polished glass. Miss Marple approached slowly, putting his hand on the wooden curve of her flank. Then she noticed it. A slight scratch on the ground, right next to one of the horse's back legs. It was not a simple task, but she strangely hung the light. She leaned prudently, her knees cute, and looked more closely. It was wax. Splash-lead and melted, as if she had been blown away by a candle. And next to it, almost hidden under the plinth, was something other than a piece of fabric. Miss Marple took out a handkerchief and delicately extracted the tiny piece. It was delicate, like lace, and a slight perfume clung there. No lavender, after all, but of violet. A perfume of violet. Miss Marple got up slowly, the rocking horse now seeing her observing her with her shiny and inexpressive eyes. She turned her attention to the library. On the top shelf was an old white iron box with a faded photo of Humpty Dumpty on its lid. Inside were crumpled papers, children's drawings, cutting newspapers, and a postcard. The postcard draws its attention. It was addressed to Celia M., in London. Writing was undeniably feminine. I think of you. Come back if you can. There is still time. Miss Marple closed the box, slipped the fabric into her handbag and left the room slowly. Back down, Lydia poured a glass of water in front of the buffet. She turned very much when Miss Marple entered. Did you find what you were looking for? Smiles Miss Marple. Just an old memory. Thank you, my dear. She took leave soon after, returning to the village with a quiet step, her eyes riveted on the ground as if the answers could flower among the dead leaves. This afternoon, she discreetly visited Inspector Harwood at the post. I have something curious, she said, putting the handkerchief folded on her desk. Found near the rocking horse. Wax. And a piece of lace maybe round. Flavored with violet. Harwood examined it with scowling air. So, she turned on a candle in the child's room? Or someone else did it, said Miss Marple. Maybe to report. Or to create an atmosphere. Candles are more than a lighting inspector. They create an atmosphere. Do you think this piece of fabric comes from her dress? It is possible. But I would like to know if he corresponds to something that Lydia Halbert has. Or possessed. Harwood looked up with his eyes, with pleaded eyes. Do you think she was there that evening? Miss Marple leaned forward. I think someone entered the nursery after Celia went to bed. Someone who had once known her or who feared what she had come to say. And I think it was not Charles Halberd. So who? Miss Marple smiles weakly. This, I believe, will be revealed in time. But you could start by asking Miss Halberd when she wore purple scent last time. Harwood made a note, but the gaze on his face betrayed skepticism. Miss Marple got up and recovered her handbag. I often find, she said gently, that people do not always remember what they wore. But they never forget what they felt when they wore it. Outside, the wind had reproduced, rustling through hedges with almost agitated energy. And in the motionless silence of her mind, Miss Marple began to see the form of a truth hidden in the folds of the domestic order, a more tangled truth than most suspected. Back at the chalet, she presented her discoveries on the table, the lace scrap, the light spot of wax and the postcard. Small things, each easily rejected. But Miss Marple had learned a long time ago that it was precisely such trifles that betrayed the meshes of the net in a very complete lie. And something about Lydia Halberd's creche was starting to feel less like a sanctuary of childhood dreams and more as a long-abandoned scene, now welcoming a last tragic performance. The wind has changed in Little Dedham the following journey in the direction, but also in mood. Conversations, once lively and animated, became strained with restraint. The locals no longer openly theorized about Celia Moffat's death. They lowered their voices, huddled closer, and cast cautious glances toward the village of Gossington Hall. For Miss Marple, this change was telling. It meant that, somewhere beneath the speculation, the truth had begun to simmer. At her niece's cottage, she sat with her knitting, though the wool rested busily on her lap. Her mind wandered back to the nursery, the rocking horse, and the faint scent of violets. The postcard she had in her possession still bore the initials L. It was a thread she couldn't ignore, especially after what Sarah had told her about the familiarity of the scent. Violets were no longer a common scent. And they persisted. Miss Marple had developed a discreet habit of observing people when they were not being observed. She had learned long ago that the truth seldom came when summoned directly. It liked to insinuate itself intermittently, by silences, absent-minded gestures, or by slight tremors that betrayed a guilty conscience. It was in this spirit that she invited Sarah to tea. The young maid arrived late in the afternoon, her face twisted with apprehension, but her eyes lit up when Miss Marple offered her a place by the fire and a plate of fresh shortbread. "Come now," Miss Marple said kindly. "A warm hearth makes everything more bearable." Sarah nodded gratefully and took a bite, chewing slowly. "I know this isn't my place," she said at last, "but something's been bothering me, and I haven't mentioned it to anyone." Miss Marple clasped her hands. "You may speak freely, my dear. I've always found that small worries, left unspoken, become monstrous." Sarah leaned in slightly, her voice low. "It's about the morning after the garden party. I was the one who went to clean the nursery after she was taken away. Mrs. Halberd told me to tidy up and check that the windows were locked." "Oh, really?" There was something in the fireplace. Ashes, as if someone had burned some papers. I didn't pay attention to it at first, but there was something metallic in the ashes. A small clasp, or rather a hook. It looked like it belonged on a handbag. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind jolted to the missing details. "Have you kept it?" Sarah shook her head. "Mrs. Halberd came in while I was looking at it. She saw it too. She told me not to worry and that she would take care of it. I never saw it again." "Thank you, Sarah. That was very helpful." It confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions, something had been destroyed in that room, something personal and deliberate. Celia hadn't simply died in that childhood bedroom. She had been silenced. And someone had tried to erase her presence afterward. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a note and had it delivered to Gossington Hall, requesting a private interview with Charles Halberd the following morning. To her mild surprise, he agreed. She found him in the study, pacing a row of heavy bookshelves. He looked older than he had a few days ago, and there was a heaviness on his shoulders. "Miss Marple," he said with a small, forced smile. "Forgive me if I'm abrupt. It's been a complicated few days." "I understand," she said, sitting down gently in the leather chair opposite his desk. "And I won't take up too much of your time. I just wanted to ask you one simple thing." He raised an eyebrow, clearly suspicious. "Come on. Why did Celia come here, exactly?" "I'm not talking about what she wrote in her note. I'm talking about what you think. Because something tells me she didn't just come to reminisce about old times." Charles looked at her for a long moment, then walked over to the window. "We were together," he said finally. "Years ago. Briefly. I was 24. That was before I met Lydia. I had invested in a theater company. Celia was in one of the touring productions. She had charm. She came back expecting something," Miss Marple said. "A promise kept?" He nodded once. "I suppose. She said she had no one. She implied she'd fallen on hard times. But I didn't think it was blackmail, not exactly. She didn't threaten. I was just expecting something." "And you didn't say anything to Lydia?" "I didn't want to upset her," he said quickly. "That was a mistake from another life. A mistake that followed you home." Charles sighed heavily. "I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. I spoke to her that night and left her in the bedroom. When I came back up the next morning, she was already gone. I swear." Miss Marple stood up, satisfied that she had heard what she wanted. When she reached the door, she turned around. "One last question. Have you ever given Celia anything? A present, perhaps, with your initials?" Charles looked surprised. "I don't remember. Maybe. A pocket mirror, perhaps? Or a hair slide? Something small." Later that day, Miss Marple called at the vicarage to speak to Mrs. Entwistle, whose appreciation of village traditions often led her to pick up curious details that others overlooked. Lydia Halberd, the vicar's wife, sipping her tea with great concentration, came from a family of silences. Her mother was very withdrawn, and Lydia's first engagement ended abruptly. It is said that she had a nervous breakdown in her 20s and was taken to Switzerland to rest. "Switzerland?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes. A kind of nervous breakdown. She came back months later and never spoke of it again. But I always thought there was something strange about the way she looked at the children. As if she lacked self-confidence." Miss Marple said nothing, but the ties were beginning to tighten. A hidden past. A woman frightened by her own memories. And now, a dead actress in a forgotten nursery. The secret was established that evening when Miss Marple, returning from her shopping, passed the churchyard and saw Sarah again, sitting on the stone bench under the linden tree. The girl was pale and anxious. "Miss Marple," she said as the older woman approached. "I remembered something else. The day before the party, Mrs. Halberd had come into the nursery. Late. I saw her carrying something. A picture frame, I think. She didn't know I had seen her. What had she done with it? I don't know. But the next day, she was gone. Miss Marple gently took her hand. You did very well, Sarah. Now don't tell anyone else. Not yet. That evening, by the soft firelight, Miss Marple wrote down her thoughts in her diary, not for posterity, but for clarity. There had been a child, once upon a time. A nursery prepared. A wife sent away. A scandal contained. And then, years later, a ghost returned in the form of Celia Moffat, seeking not revenge, but recognition. But someone at Gossington Hall couldn't allow it. As the fire crackled and the shadows lengthened in the room, Miss Marple closed her diary and peered into the darkness. There was more new. Secrets don't stay buried forever. Especially when they've had their own nursery. Thursday began with a soft, insistent rain. It tapped on the windows of Little Dedham like a gentle reminder that some things need to be cleared before they can be understood. The sky was low and the roads were covered in puddles. Miss Marple, never to be deterred by the weather, stepped out with her umbrella, her step steady and her spirits even higher. At the station, Inspector Harwood was reviewing the report somberly. The London forensic team had finally delivered their findings. Celia Moffat, they concluded, had died of blunt force head trauma, inflicted shortly after midnight. No defensive wounds. No signs of forced entry. No conclusive evidence of a struggle. Just a single blow. Precise. Deliberate. There was no blood on the floor, but traces had been found in the groove under the rocking horse's base. Small, almost invisible to the naked eye, but conclusive. The murder weapon was probably the curved metal stirrup attached to the rocking horse's flank. This was not an impulsive murder. That much was clear. Harwood rubbed his temples. He didn't like puzzles. And this one, with its elegant house and respectable inhabitants, was proving uncomfortably complex. Then came the phone call. Constable Drew entered the office, his eyes full of urgency. "Sir," he said, "we've just received a report from the gardener at Gossington. He says he found something buried under the hedge and while pruning the roses." Harwood stood up at once. "What sort of thing?" "A photograph, sir. In a silver frame. Water damaged, but still visible." He thought it resembled one of the people mentioned in the newspaper article, so he handed it over. A few minutes later, the inspector was holding the object in his hands. It was a framed photograph of a young woman holding a baby, about 6 months old. Holding a picnic blanket. The woman, unmistakably, was Celia Moffat. Her smile was radiant, and her eyes expressed that unmistakable maternal pride. But the real shock was on the back. Written in thin, looping cursive letters, the words to Lydia. "You said she would never be forgotten. I kept my promise." Harwood stared at the photograph for a long time, then sat down heavily behind his desk. This wasn't just about murder anymore. It was something else, something completely deeper and infinitely more personal. He immediately sent Constable Drew to fetch Miss Marple. When she arrived at the station, the rain still gently dripping from her umbrella, Harwood was pacing. "Thank you for coming," he said quickly, handing her the photograph. Miss Marple examined it carefully, her expression unreadable. "I was afraid of something like this," she finally whispered. "But I hadn't expected to see it laid out so clearly before us." "She had a child?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And not just any child. A child who, I suspect, never lived in Lydia Halbert's world. A child whose existence was erased. Harwood exhaled slowly. Why had it sent this to Lydia? She didn't send it, Miss Marple replied. She brought it. That's why she came. Not for the money. Not even for fame. She came to remind Lydia of a promise they'd made. A secret they'd shared. And, perhaps, to ask her to confess the truth before it was too late. Harwood frowned. You think the child was Lydia's? It's possible, Miss Marple said. Or at least, that's how the story would play out if you looked at it more closely. I suspect Lydia was sent away, years ago, under the guise of a nervous breakdown or some other delicate euphemism. Switzerland, wasn't it? Harwood nodded. She came back changed. Calm. Composed. And soon after, she married Charles Halbert. All very well. All very well. But some stories don't end like that. Sometimes they start again unexpectedly. Harwood tapped the frame. But Celia was in the picture. Yes, Miss Marple said. Which suggests she didn't just know about the child she'd raised. Perhaps as her own. Perhaps at Lydia's request. It wouldn't be uncommon. Many are the arrangements made discreetly between women cornered by circumstances. Why kill her, then? Harwood asked. Miss Marple's eyes became thoughtful. Because the past is never as silent as you think. If Lydia had built her life on a version of the truth that took neither Celia nor this child into account, then Celia's return would have threatened everything. Especially if the child had died. Worse still if the child had survived and was searching for answers. Harwood stood. Lydia Halbert will need to be questioned. Formally. Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. Gently, Inspector. There's a lot of pain in all this. And it's not all guilt. Later that afternoon, under gray skies and escorted by the police, Lydia Halbert was brought into the station. She walked with dignity, her hair neatly tied back, her coat buttoned tightly despite the heat of the room. She said nothing at first, just stared at the photograph in front of her. Then she sat down. Slowly. As if her bones had aged a decade in a few seconds. This was meant to stay buried, she whispered. I begged her not to come. Mrs. Halbert, Harwood said softly, we think you knew Celia Moffat before her visit last week. Yes, Lydia said. She was my cousin. But more than that, she was my savior. I was 17. My father would have disowned me. My mother was helpless. Celia took me to Switzerland, then came back and claimed the baby as her own. She raised her, kept me away from the scandal. What happened to the child? Lydia looked up slowly. She died. At 4. A fever. Celia never recovered. And I tried to forget. I married Charles. I built this life. But Celia she couldn't forget. She said I owed her the truth. That I owed it to myself. Did you kill her? Lydia closed her eyes. No. I wanted her to leave, yes. I was terrified. But I didn't hurt her. I left her in the nursery with that photograph and told her to rest. I said we'd talk in the morning. And anyway, who did this? Harwood asked. Lydia shook her head slowly. I don't know. Unless she hesitated. Unless she said something to Charles. About the child. About me. He has always protected the life we built. He would do anything to preserve it. Miss Marple looked at Harwood but said nothing. That night, as the storm approached and the wind stirred the ivy around Gossington Hall, Charles Halberd sat alone in his study, staring into the hearth. A fire burned gently, crackling with a vague defiance. He didn't see the photograph again, but its image haunted him all the same. And Miss Marple, sitting by her own fire in Much Benham, finally resumed her knitting. The storm was reaching its peak. And with it, the moment of truth. Hidden entering the light. The day after the storm, the air in Little Dedham was crisp and bright, cleared by the wind and rain. The village seemed almost too peaceful, as if the countryside itself had decided to take a deep breath. But at Gossington Hall, the silence had thickened, the rooms echoing with unspoken words. Miss Marple, sitting at her desk in her niece's house, put down her fountain pen after rereading the short letter she had written. Her eyes, though aged and kind, shone with a determined light. She had known from the start that this case, like so many before it, would not be solved by brute force or confessions under pressure. It would take something more subtle, something humane. So she sent the note. It arrived at Gossington Hall by hand later that afternoon. Charles Halberd, alone in the living room, his newspaper unread and his brandy untouched, opens it without interest until he sees the signature. Miss Jane Marple cordially invites Mr. Charles Halberd to tea at 4 p.m. today. A formal, discreet conversation. He almost crumpled it, then stopped. Instead, he folded it neatly and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He arrives at the cottage right on time. Miss Marple, who was waiting for him with her tea set out and a plate of lemon scones still warm from the oven, greeted him with all the warmth of a long-lost aunt. "Mr. Halberd. The kettle has just boiled, and the weather is finally wise." He gave her a tight smile. "Miss Marple. I confess I don't know what this is for." She poured the tea with a gentle hand. "Oh, nothing official, I assure you. Just a chance to talk frankly. We're so much better with tea, don't you think?" He didn't reply, but he took the cup that was offered to him and sat stiffly in the chair opposite hers. Miss Marple watched him with silent attention. His face had thinned slightly in the past week, and though he sat upright, a tension in his shoulders betrayed a storm not yet past. "I was thinking," she began, stirring her tea, "how strange it is, the way life turns on itself. One moment a man is building a future, the next he is defending a past he never quite buried." Halberd didn't reply. "You must have loved Lydia deeply to marry her after what she had been through." He looked at her sharply. "What she told you about the child was a tragedy. But that was a long time ago." "Tragedies seldom stay where they are," Miss Marple said softly. "Especially ones you never speak of again. They spread." She set her spoon down with a soft clink. "I find," she continued, "that murder is very rarely linked to violence. It's usually linked to fear. Fear of losing one's position, one's reputation, one's illusion of control." Charles Halberd clenched his jaw. Miss Marple let the silence hang, softly, before adding, "When did you realize that it had come back not to harm Lydia, but to save her from the burden she had carried alone?" He answered quietly. She hadn't come to help. She had come to unravel everything. She had brought a photograph, Miss Marple had said. Not to denounce, but to reconnect. They demand nothing. She offered a chance to tell the truth. That was why she had left the frame in the nursery. She wanted Lydia to remember not to suffer, but to reconcile. She should have stayed away, he said suddenly, his voice rising with suppressed fury. We had our lives. That was settled. I protected Lydia. I always have. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Even when she hadn't asked for it. He stared at her, then looked away. I went upstairs that night, he said finally. After Lydia had gone to bed, I saw the light on under the nursery door. Celia was awake, sitting on the floor with that picture. She looked up at me as if I were a stranger. Miss Marple said nothing. She waited. She said the child was mine. There it was. The last piece. Charles ran a hand through his hair. She said she'd lied to protect me too. That she wanted to start all over again. She wasn't angry, just tired. I'm so tired. And she smiled. Miss Marple's hands clasped gently in her lap. She said I should hold the truth in my hands. That it would set me free. Her voice broke, almost imperceptibly. I picked up the rocking horse. Just the stirrup, to show her how easily things could break. But she flinched slightly, and I didn't want that. It was a movement, a moment. Miss Marple closed her eyes. And when she did, there was panic. I took the photograph, he whispered. I buried it in the hedge the next morning. I didn't say anything to Lydia. She thought Celia had left early, until Sarah screamed. Miss Marple opened her eyes and looked at him not with judgment, but with the quiet sadness of understanding. What now? I don't know, he said thinly. I don't know what to do. She got up and went to the window, pulling back the curtain. The inspector's coming, she said softly. You'll tell him, I imagine. Charles Halbert stood up slowly. His face was pale, but a strange calm came over me, as if the weight he had carried for so long had finally lifted. I will. As he left the cottage and walked down the path to the gate, the inspector met him halfway. The two men paused, exchanged words too low to be heard, and then walked together to the station. Miss Marple, alone now, sat down again by the fire. She took up her knitting, picked up the needles, and began knitting the collar of a soft blue cardigan. Her fingers moved with steady precision. Outside, the world went on. A dog barked. A bicycle bell rang in the distance. Somewhere, a child laughed. And inside, Miss Marple allowed herself a single sigh. The childhood bedroom, once filled with silence and sadness, could now truly be empty. Its ghosts had been proclaimed. Not vanquished, perhaps, but known at last. The next day came with a hesitant light, pale and thin as milk. A profound silence had settled over Little Dedham, not out of fear, but in that thoughtful stillness that follows an answered question. The air had changed, lighter perhaps, but not quite serene. The villagers, sensing this mute change, resumed their routines with cautious grace. The news traveled quietly, like all the most serious news in the village. No dramatic arrest, no handcuffs, no shouting. Just the gentle news that Charles Halbert had gone to the station with Inspector Harwood and was not expected to return to Gossington Hall any time soon. Inside the manor house, the curtains were drawn and the gravel drive was quiet. Lydia Halbert hadn't been seen since the previous morning. Mrs. Finch said she had glimpsed the poor woman through an upstairs window, sitting stiffly in a chair, her back perfectly straight, like a girl about to leave school. And Miss Marple? She wasn't resting, as some had supposed. Nor was she enjoying quiet satisfaction. Instead, she was tidying her niece's spare room and preparing a tray of boiled eggs and toast. It was a task that gave her comfort. The order of small things made the disorder of large things more bearable. But late in the morning, there was a knock at the door. Inspector Harwood was standing in the drive, cap in hand. He looked tired, but not dejected, more like a man emerging from a thick fog and getting used to brighter weather. "I thought I might pay my respects," he said. "And if you have a moment, ask me how you pieced it all together." "In truth, I had the facts. But the motive," he sighed, "slipped out." Miss Marple smiled faintly and beckoned him in. They sat in the living room, the fire giving off a steady, gentle warmth. Miss Marple handed him a cup of tea, as she had done many times with so many troubled souls, and then she began gently, but precisely. "I think," she said, "that the heart of the matter lay not in what had been done, but in what had been hidden. The tragedy had begun long before Celia Moffat set foot in that childhood bedroom. It had begun with a girl frightened, ashamed, and sent away to protect her family name. Lydia, you see, had done what many women of her time were expected to do. To disappear long enough for the world to forget she had been in trouble." Harwood nodded. "And Celia?" "Celia," Miss Marple continued, "was the only one who hadn't forgotten. She had taken the child in as her own, or at least raised her, protecting Lydia from scandal. But the child died, and something inside Celia broke. She had sacrificed so much of her own life, in so many ways, and when she had nothing left to hold on to, she began to want the truth acknowledged. Not for herself, perhaps, but for Lydia. She tried to make peace." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She hadn't come to destroy, but to bond. To give Lydia the chance to face what had been buried with the child. But Charles Halberta saw her return as a threat. You see, Inspector, it wasn't guilt that drove him. It was controlled. He had built his life on a lie, carefully maintained. He hadn't expected the past to return with a smiling face and a photograph in its handbag." Harwood sipped his tea thoughtfully. He pretended it was an accident. "Oh, I believe it," Miss Marple replied. "But that doesn't change what had happened. When Celia revealed that the child might be his, she shattered the image he had built up. In that instant, he lost his temper and, with one tragic movement, his future too." "The rocking horse," Harwood said, shaking his head. "Who would have thought?" "It had been in this room for years," Miss Marple said softly. "A silent witness to a life that had never taken root. I dare say it was symbolic, in a way. Innocence denied, the playroom that had never seen a child. It stood there, still and waiting, like the truth itself." Harwood put down his cup. "By the way, you were right about the perfume. We found an old bottle of violets in Lydia's drawer. She hadn't worn it for years and said it reminded her too much of the past. But Celia wore it the night she died. I think she wanted Lydia to remember, even before she saw the photograph." Miss Marple nodded, her hands resting on her knees. "It's often the case, I find, that the dead speak most clearly through the details they leave behind. A perfume. A scrap of lace. A photograph in a silver frame. And the postcard? It was," Miss Marple said, "the beginning of the end. A quiet message, full of hope. It read, 'You said she would never be forgotten. I kept my promise.' I think it was a message from Celia to Lydia, written years before, but never sent, or perhaps sent, and ignored. Either way, she had taken it with her. She wanted Lydia to send it back, perhaps to remind her that the love and sacrifice had not been in vain. Harwood sat back in his chair, frowning, deep in thought. "You once said something," he said slowly, "about people not forgetting how they feel when they wear something. It struck me. It's true, you know. You remember feelings, even when you forget the facts." Miss Marple smiled. "Quite so, Inspector. Emotions have the longest memories." He stood up and nodded politely to her. "Well, thank you, Miss Marple. Again. I suppose there will be an official inquest, and Mr. Halberd will have his place in court. But justice, in one form or another, is already here." She watched him leave, the latch clicking shut behind him. The rest of the day passed quietly. Gwenda came in from her shopping and noticed that the air was sweeter, as if the village had been aired. That evening, Miss Marple went to the churchyard, her shawl tightly wrapped around her shoulders. She stopped at a small moss-covered bench and sat for a while under the old yew tree. The wind blew gently through the branches. The bells chimed the quarter hour. It wasn't really grief she felt. Or triumph. Just the pain of knowing that even the most peaceful lives are rich in stories, and that sometimes, to find peace, you must first lift the veil on pain. When she got home, she found Sarah waiting for her by the gate. "Miss Marple," she said timidly. "Will you be all right? Mrs. Halberd, I mean." Mrs. Marple took Sarah's hand and patted it gently. "In time, my dear. The truth, once told, leaves its mark. But it also heals. Mrs. Halberd has kept silent for many years. Now she can wear something lighter." Sarah looked relieved, if a little sad. "And you?" she asked. Mrs. Marple laughed. "Oh, I'll finish my knitting and see about the next village fete. I heard there's a competition for the best chutney this year." Sarah smiled. "I hope you win." As Miss Marple walked into the cottage and the fire greeted her with its familiar glow, she sat down and picked up her needles again. Outside, the wind died down. The nursery at Gossington Hall would now be silent. Truly silent. The story had been told. The grief had been faced. And the riddle was no longer empty. Autumn came to Little Dedham at the end of the week. Gold and russet leaves formed in slow swirls along the village green, and the air carried that distinctive, sharp scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Life, as often happens, had resumed its rhythm, but not quite as before. Gossington Park was closed to visitors. Its gates were closed, its gardens silent. The once lively manor house had fallen silent, as if in mourning for something unsaid. Lydia Halberd was said to have gone to stay with distant cousins in Bath, for health reasons, as the vicar's wife reported in the tone usually reserved for delicate personal situations. She had left a letter with the housekeeper, ordering nothing to be touched in the nursery. She had said it was to be left as it was, Mrs. Finch confided in Miss Marple during one of their morning meetings. "A place of remembrance," she called it. "It sends a chill down my spine." Miss Marple, who had seen more than just chills, simply agreed. Some rooms should never be repainted too quickly. The residents, for the most part, accepted the official explanation. Celia Moffat's death had been judged to be a passionate and spontaneous act, the result of old wounds reopened. Charles Halberd had confessed to the murder, and justice would deal with him in due course. But the village would not speak his name aloud. He became, in a way, a ghost of his own creation. And Celia, too, had become more than just a victim. In death, her story was seared into the village memory. Some described it as tragic, others as foolish, a few as noble. But all agreed that she had returned not for revenge, but for a more elusive conclusion. Miss Marple, however, knew the truth was more complicated. It always was. One afternoon, as the leaves danced on the pavements and the smoke from the chimney rose in slow spirals, she was sitting in the living room by the fire with a tray of tea and her niece, Gwenda, who had just returned from a short stay in Brighton. "I missed all the excitement," said Gwenda, clasping her hands in her lap. "But I heard you were at the heart of it all, as usual." "Not at the heart," replied Miss Marple. "Merely observing from the sidelines." "Still," said Gwenda, "how horrible it must have been. All that sadness. Poor Celia. And Lydia, I can't imagine carrying such a thing for so many years." Miss Marple took a long sip of tea. "Women often carry more than you realize." Gwenda tilted her head. "Do you think Lydia will get over it?" "In time," said Miss Marple softly. "There's a kind of healing that comes when you finally let the truth take its place. Even the painful truth. She must feel so alone now." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said in a softer voice. "But sometimes solitude is necessary before reconciliation. Lydia will have to reconcile herself not only with the memory of Celia, but also with herself." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a brief, warm glow across the carpet. "And Charles?" Gwenda asked after a silence. "He will have to answer," Miss Marple replied. "Though I suspect he has already begun to pay for his sins. The court may judge, but it is the weight of conscience that truly condemns a man." Gwenda sat back, overcome. "It is all so tragic." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not without redemption. Painful as it is, the truth gives a voice to the voiceless. Celia did not die forgotten. She forced those who had once silenced her to finally listen." They sat together in complicit silence, the fire crackling and the rain starting again, faint against the windowpanes. Later that week, Miss Marple made a final visit to the town of Gossington Hall. She had written ahead, and the housekeeper had agreed to let her into the nursery one last time before the house closed for the season. The air was fresh, tinged with the scent of dust and lavender. The room was exactly as she remembered it. The pale blue wallpaper. The faded wooden rocking horse. The shelf with its silent sentinels of forgotten toys. And on the sill, a small vase of violets, freshly placed. She stood there for a moment, her gloved hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed on the rocking horse. "It was never a place for play," she murmured. "But now it can rest." She walked to the bookcase and carefully replaced a slim volume she had borrowed months before the tragedy began. A children's garden of verse. Appropriate, she thought. The poems were full of nostalgia and shadow, but also light. As she turned to leave, she noticed something recently added to the shelf. It was a small photograph in a polished silver frame. Celia, younger, smiling, holding a child in her arms. No inscription. No name. Just a memory. Miss Marple left the nursery silently and went down the stairs, the echo of her footsteps melting into the silence of the large house. Outside, the village clock struck 12. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, someone laughed. Life was moving on. Miss Marple walked slowly down the gravel path, her thoughts drifting like leaves dancing in the wind. Not all stories end in triumph, she reflected, but some do end in understanding. And that's often for the best. As she passed the churchyard, she paused for a moment, as she always did, by the bench under the linden tree. She sat there in silence, letting the wind blow around her, the last rays of the autumn sun casting long shadows on the grass. Then she got up, dusted off her coat, and went home, ready to face whatever mystery life might throw at her next. For even in quiet villages, amid gardens, tea trays, and polite conversation, the human heart remains the greatest enigma of all. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever gentle, would always be there to solve it.